Um, Now we'll look at classifications because we all see a lot of stuff about classifications. This is we use the White system. It's Frederick White was an engineer, mechanical engineer in the New York Central. He said back around the turn of the century, he says, we gotta get something here because this is complicated. We got to figure out some way. And so he came up with the numbering system that we use for steam locomotives. The lead truck is here, and you have to have, like, passenger engines have to have four wheels up here because you have to pull that engine around. That's a lot of mass, a lot of inertia, and you have to pull that engine around the curve. And if they didn't have it, they learned very quickly you got to have, especially if the track is rough, you got to have a lead truck. Now the axle loading on these is about half or less of the drivers, but it's enough to pull the engine. Then you have the drivers that are driven by the pistons. That's the middle number. And then in back is the trailing truck. And that's does two things. One is it supports the firebox, and also if the engine has to back up, it allows the engine to negotiate curves going back. Now in the UK, they were using they go by axles. So as a Pacific is a 231, and then they came up with a UIC code. I think that comes from the continent of Europe, and the powered. It's actually a good system. So your idler axles are just numbers, and then your powered axles, no matter what's powering them, in this case it's a Pacific locomotive, so you have two axles, idler axles, and you have C means three powered axles, and then one is one idler axle. And then guess what? We use that for diesels because a BB is two axles powered, and then in front and two axles in back. A passenger engine in the olden days was an A1A, A1A. That means there was a motor, and then the center axle didn't have a motor, and then the back axle had a motor. And then, of course, most of them now are CCs, which means three motors in front, three motors in back. Interestingly, General Electric is now making freight locomotives that are A1A. And they have this exotic system to unload the center axle when they start the train, and then once they get going they only need four motors, so it cuts down on maintenance. So the Burlington Northern's got some of those. Not they don't use those on coal and heavy trains, but for manifest they work pretty well. And then there's this is the four-wheel lead truck, and the American we talked about, the Atlantic, and the Jubilee was the 444. Reading made them, and so did the Canadian Pacific. They had some of those. Here's the American. And then we get to the 10-wheeler, the Pacific, the Hudson. The 12-wheeler is a 480. They had those early in the 1900s. And most railroads didn't keep them, but the Norfolk and Western ran those things for 50 years. They ran them right till the end of the 50s. They had some good locomotives. The 482, that's now we have that's a mountain. And of course, on the New York Central, they called the Mohawks because they didn't have any mountains. So, and then Northern Pacific asked for a 484, and that's why they call it a Northern. And they had all sorts of names. Every railroad had their own name. The New York Central called them Niagaras. Down south, of course, they couldn't be Northern, so they had to be Dixies. And the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac called them presidents, and everybody had a different name. So, but here's the Pennsylvania K4 Pacific, and they had like 450 of them standardized. It was a very good locomotive, and they ran them for right up into the 50s. And here's a Pacific on the Sioux line. Here's the Hudson. Now that came along a little later. The New York Central said, well, let's put a bigger firebox on, and so we'll make it a 464. And then we got to the 484. Here's the really famous one. That's the Union Pacific. That's a 484 and big tender, and they would lope along just fine with a passenger train or freight. And the 844 never was retired. It's been in continuous service since 1950. So they still use it obviously for excursions and stuff now. But then we get into the Mastodon, the Southern Pacific, and that was basically taking basically it's a big freight and steam locomotive. And then the Union Pacific had a 412-2 that Alco built for them. And even though I had 12 drivers and they had to have a lot of lateral support, we'll look at a picture of one in a minute. And because it was hard to make something like that go around a curve.
Right.
And then on the bottom there is the Breitspurbahn. I had never heard about this. Bob, you probably heard about this. The Nazis were building this super train, 13 foot 6-inch gauge, double deck trains. Now it was a great idea, actually. If they'd done it, it would have been.
You could carry immense amounts of war material to the front.
Yes,
which was the whole point of having the railroad in World War II.
That's exactly right. So, but anyway, here's the 412.
No, I wasn't too up on that. I was aware they had a failed experiment, but
I'd never seen. They had a picture on Google of it. Here's the 412-2, and they were a little nervous about putting 12 drivers there, but these drivers in the middle. Whoops, sorry. These drivers in the middle have all sorts of lateral support because otherwise you obviously wouldn't be able to get around a curve. But they had like 88 of them. They ran them from Cheyenne to Omaha and from Kansas City to Denver, and they were very successful. But they figured out that they needed to have something a little bit more flexible, and that's what led to the Challenger, the 4664, where you take each set. You have 2 sets of 6 drivers rather than 1 set of 12.
Right. Okay.
The other problem they ran into is the rods got so heavy because now you got all this, 4,000 horsepower going down this rod. And so they had to put a 3rd cylinder in the middle. And so that cut the weight down. And then they had to put a crank on this thing. So the 3rd cylinder feeds this driver, and then the main rods feed this driver. But they were very successful.
Wow.
And then the Pennsylvania was going right at the end. They were a big coal hauler, so they tried to keep coal going right to the end. And they
it's
got
cheap for them.
Huh?
Cheap for them.
Oh yeah, it was cheap, absolutely. And they were in love with it. And so they came up with this concept of a duplex drive. Now this is one frame. These are not articulated, but they ran steam. It's a 4-4-6-4. They ran steam to both cylinders at the same time. These are a little bigger because it's driving 6 wheels, but very efficient. I think they were like 8,000 horsepower, huge firebox. It was a huge locomotive, very efficient. But as we've seen, they built quite a few of them. I think they had 50 of them or something, and they ran, but they couldn't compete with the diesels, so they eventually disappeared in the 50s. And then here's the Breitspurbahn. So there's a regular German, looks like a decapod, and then here's this Breitspurbahn, the concept, and they had the lines all designed and everything, going to build them all over Germany. And here's a picture of it. Double deck, 13-foot gauge. Boy, you could really haul some stuff on that thing. Whew. But that was Hitler's idea. He really wanted to push that. So.
But he was big on huge things.
Yes. Yeah, they were talking the 1,000-year Reich.
Yeah.
So, okay, then we got into the articulateds. The big ones are the 2660 on the Denver and Salt Lake. And then the Norfolk and Western late in the game built 2664s that were very good. And the Chesapeake and Ohio had the 2666. Here's the 2660 on the Denver and Salt Lake, and they needed that because they went up over Rollins Pass, which was replaced by the Moffat Tunnel, but they had sometimes 5 of these things to push a train over the pass. Just pure tractive effort at 7 miles an hour. Here is a 2664, and this one is Baltimore, Ohio. Norfolk and Western had them. Seaboard had them. Quite a few railroads it basically replaced 2 locomotives. Here's the 2666, and that's from our friends at Lima, from Lima, Ohio. And
where was that? Lima?
Yeah. But they built a huge firebox under this thing, And so it's 2666, and they needed a 6-axle truck, and it pulled really well. And but then they waited, and they found out it was about 50,000 pounds overweight. So, but fortunately, the C&O had really good track, so they could run them. They used them very heavily. And then the last ones are the Yellowstone we're familiar with. That's it was named after the Northern Pacific because they asked for it to run across North Dakota, the undulating up and down track. And then of course Penske tried the steam turbine, trying to get some of that efficiency. So here's the Yellowstone, and they were so successful that a number of other railroads bought them, including the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, who ran them well into the 60s. Because these things would take 180 loaded iron ore cars from northern Minnesota down to Proctor.
14,000, or was it higher? 14,000 pounds, or was it higher?
Yeah, 14,000 tons. Yeah.
Tons. Yeah,
Yeah,
like serious
14,000
tons.
tons.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And then the final one are the Challenger, the big boy, which we've heard a lot about. Bayer Garrett, if you remember that Steam video I put out when I was in South Africa, that was a Bayer Garrett. That was 2882. And then Southern Pacific turned the 2884 around and made it a 4882, which we'll look at in a second. So here's the Challenger. This is a Northern Pacific. They bought them. The Union Pacific had them. The Delaware and Hudson had some, which was interesting for a smaller railroad to buy them. Here's the Southern Pacific, their oil burner. So they just turned them around for Donner's Pass. They had all the snow sheds and tunnels. And of course, here's the big boy. We've seen that one a lot. That was a good move getting that thing running. Here's the Erie Triplex. It was a good idea in theory, but the boiler just couldn't produce enough steam. And so they used it as a pusher on some of their grades because it could only go about 10 miles an hour and run out of steam. Here's the Penske steam turbine. So instead of having piston, they had this turbine running sideways right here. And but it ran for a couple of years, but it, again, couldn't. You're losing all that heat from boiling the water. So, well, that's it. And next month we'll do part 2. We'll look at some pictures of steam locomotives. So, any questions?
One comment I had thinking about all this history is that the Romans knew about steam,
Yeah.
and they knew how powerful it was, and they were starting to think about how they could use it to pull chariots or wagons or something. And but then with all the politics and running into the Dark Ages and everything, that didn't happen. However, I think if it had happened back then, let's say what happened in 1825 happened in 825, we would have had, I think, our age of technology 1,000 years sooner than we did. And what would have been interesting about that is that we would have had those advances in the technology with a lot fewer people on the earth.
Yes.
And I think that would have been an interesting set of circumstances, because right now we're just trying to figure out how can we keep our technology ahead of our population growth.
Yes.
It's a race. It seems like we're trying to figure out all these climate issues and all the damage we're causing, and a lot of it's because of how so many people we have wanting to live at a very high level of life. So I often wondered if the Romans had figured things out. They were such good engineers. How Western history might have changed or been different.
I wonder if those would have been copper engines. They had steel, but they didn't have it in quantity. So I wonder, would that have driven a steel industry to have more steel around?
I
Whether
think
it's wrought iron or
metallurgy-
whatever, but my
I
point
think
is
metallurgy would have advanced
along with.
fairly along with it. Yeah, Bob, I think so. And so many discoveries that have been made because of railroading in the 1800s and 1900s would have been made if railroading had occurred 1,000 years earlier.
Right.
So
That's
it's
very
kind of fun. to
Interesting thought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, because we were watching a thing about the library in Alexandria, and this professor was saying that basically the knowledge in the world dropped by half between 100 AD and 800 AD. Because
Yeah.
they burned that library, they burned a lot of books. Many areas learning was not promoted. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that we did get from the Romans is I think the gauge between the wheels of the chariots was 4 feet 6.5. And
We're back to the two horses' butts.
Yes.
yeah, right. So when the English decided to start build railroads, they figured, well, we'll just do it so we could run our carts and our wagons and stuff on the rails, and that width was from the Romans.
Yeah.